Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the specially called meeting for Wednesday, August the 13th. Ms. Hilberg, will you please call roll?
Yes, sir. Councilman De La Garza?
I am present.
Councilman Kidder?
Here.
Councilwoman Butler?
Present.
Councilwoman Scott?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Young?
Here.
And Mayor Crocker.
Here, if you would, please stand and join me for the pledges, followed by a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Thank you. Please be seated. All right. Again, welcome, everyone. Mr. Garza, I understand that we do not have announcements, reminders, or any public and employee recognitions this evening?
Correct, we do not.
Okay, very good. Items from council. Ms. Butler, I believe you indicated you had an item from council.
First, I wanted to thank you, Mayor Crocker, for calling the special session to present details on the progress of the Water System Subcommittee this evening. I also want to acknowledge the many residents and business owners who have shared their concerns with me directly. I recognize the challenges and uncertainty that repeated boil water notices create for households, restaurants, and other businesses in our community. Your collective frustration is heard, and that feedback solidifies how important it is that we, as council, fully understand what caused these issues. I would like to ask City Manager Garza to provide an update on the water bill credit promised to residents during the water boil in July, including details on whether all credits have been delivered and how a resident can determine the status of their credit. Additionally, I would like to request that City Manager Garza explore ways the city might provide support to the local food industry and other businesses, many of whom have reported suffering significant impact from the water boils and are still trying to recover.
Thank you, Councilwoman Butler. As it relates to your first question, as we have shared in previous meetings, our objective was to roll out that $10 credit during the billing cycles through the month of August. And so throughout the month of August, I should say. We have 4 billing cycles that go out throughout the month. And so at this time, we've already rolled out the first cycle. And so that $10 credit should be part of that first cycle of bills. And so the whole process takes the whole month, basically. And so once we get through billing cycles 2, 3, and 4, we would get through the round of all the billing cycles this month. Recall that $10 credit is solely focused on the smaller size meters intended to benefit, if you will, single-family residential. And so I just want to be very clear about that as well.
Thank you.
And as it relates to your... Okay. They're just showing me that the way that it would appear on the bill is that it shows as a negative at the very bottom, I think listed as other. And so that would be the way for them to confirm that the $10 credit is applied would be by looking at their bill, going all the way to the very bottom of that itemized list, and it'll show under other a -10 for that credit. Thank you. As it relates to your second request, obviously that would necessitate some research and some time, but we can happily prepare for a discussion around that topic at the next council meeting.
Thank you.
Are there any other items from council? No. Okay. I have no cards for citizens communication, so we will jump straight into the business at hand, which is a work session. That's a Water System Review Subcommittee update. So I'll begin just with some prepared remarks and a few things dealing with the subcommittee's work, and then we'll hand it off to Mr. Garza, who will take a deeper dive into some of the data, some of the information that we want to make available to the public. So I want to say thank you to everyone who's participating, anyone who's tuning in for this specially called meeting. As we're all aware, our community has been through 2 separate boil water notices in recent weeks, and as Councilwoman Butler acknowledged, we certainly understand and we acknowledge how unsettling and frustrating those events have been, not only for our residents, but for businesses alike. And we understand that when it comes to something as essential as water, even a temporary issue can cause hardship and worries for families. And these concerns are valid. without a doubt. And as I've stated previously, they deserve clear answers and they deserve meaningful action. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that at the same time, we've seen along with these understandable concerns, much of the public conversation, particularly that focus on social media, has been driven by incomplete or inaccurate information, and in many instances, by complete speculation. We understand, and I understand, the desire for quick answers. It's understandable. But council's responsibility is to focus on verified facts, not speculation, so that our solutions are well-founded and lasting and meaningful. In my view and experience, the seriousness of this situation requires a careful and thorough review of what happened, to look at why it happened and how we can prevent it from happening again. Speculation, unsupported opinions, rumors, knee-jerk reactions do not serve our community well at all. Instead, proper and effective governance is needed, and it requires more than an adoption of the loudest narrative. This is exactly why I formed the subcommittee of the City Council and tasked that subcommittee with the job of taking a measured, strategic, and methodical approach to investigating these issues. This approach ensures that our conclusions are based on verified facts, not on assumptions, and that the recommendations we ultimately come forward with are realistic and effective. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to provide citizens and council members with an interim update on the subcommittee's processes, on the work that's been done, and the findings that we've reached. The subcommittee has identified the root causes of the water issues that led to the boil water notices, and information about those causes will be provided as part of tonight's update. In addition, we will include information about changes and improvements that have already been implemented to the water treatment plant's operations, changes to daily oversight of the water treatment plant operations, and other improvement initiatives that are underway. So let's talk about the subcommittee. Mr. Garza, will you advance the presentation?
Trying to. Can you just move it, James? Do I need to move over there closer?
There we go.
I'll move.
There it is. So this is the makeup of the subcommittee. It was myself, Dr. Andrew Young, Mayor Pro Tem, Councilwoman Scott, City Manager Garza, who's manning the clicker, Ken Gill, our Public Works Director, and Greg Rodriguez, Public Works Assistant Director. We've also been aided by other members of staff as we've gone through our analysis, including Mr. Lesak. So since its creation, the subcommittee has worked closely, not only with this staff, but also with third parties to examine operations, and we've reviewed system data, and we've interviewed personnel with direct knowledge. This process is intentionally designed with the goal of identifying facts, of finding root causes, and ensuring that corrective actions are based on accurate and complete information. So the subcommittee is following a very clear, defined analytical process. Mr. Garza, if you'd advance, please. Here's the committee's approach. Phase 1 was a water system overview and initial briefing. During this phase, we finalized the scope of the work to be done, and we analyzed and identified the right process to be followed in our analysis of these issues. We reviewed and discussed resource materials regarding water quality concepts, specifically including materials about nitrification, which you'll learn about here shortly. And we also looked at and reviewed existing policies and procedures in place at the water treatment plant that address nitrification and other issues that may arise in the operation of a water system. We received, as part of this phase 1, an initial briefing on the boil water incidents. That included an initial timetable, or timeline rather, and available supporting data. At that point, committee members identified and asked questions relevant to the timeline, relevant to the data, and the relevant occurrences. We also asked questions about the responses that were undertaken to address the issues that arose. The committee members identified additional information and data that was needed in order to perform a thorough and proper evaluation of these issues. The committee went through an on-site tour of the water treatment facility, and during that tour, additional questions were asked regarding the ongoing processes, including those related to staffing, water sampling, testing processes, and existing equipment and technology that's currently being utilized. Please advance us. We then moved into the second stage, which was fact-finding and data collection. Based on the initial information we received and the additional data that we asked for and then received as part of this phase, a final incident timeline for each boil notice event was compiled utilizing gathered data and information. The committee reviewed relevant internal records generated as part of the ongoing operations of the water system. Those records included testing logs, pre- and post-incident water condition and quality data. Each of those records were walked through by staff with us to identify what the different aspects of those records and what the recorded data reflected and meant in each of those records that we saw. In addition, the committee received information that was gathered through interviews with water treatment plant employees. The third step in the process then is system and process overview. Now, this step is ongoing, but we have sufficiently explored and considered these issues as they relate to contributing causal factors of the boil water notices. There will be further work done to complete this step in the process, but we have completed enough of this work to give you some root cause analysis and causation information tonight. The next step was a root cause analysis. And the goal there was to determine what caused this, what were the contributing factors. This step, as I indicated, this step has been completed, and we will be sharing specifics of that with you here shortly. The final step in the process to be completed down the road is to finalize a report and to address oversight going forward. The report from the committee will be completed by development of, or the committee's work will be completed by the development of a final report, and that report will include a thorough review of the incidents. It will include the findings of the subcommittee related to these incidents, and it will include practical evidence-based recommendations for improvement of the water system. So to reiterate, the subcommittee's work is proceeding and it's ongoing, and future recommendations are expected regarding equipment, regarding technology, and regarding operational improvements. But as mentioned, at this stage of the review process, the subcommittee is confident that we have sufficient information and data and have performed a good analysis that we have identified the primary causes of the recent boil water notices. Contrary to one uninformed storyline that's emanated from the rumor mill, the causes were not the result of an infrastructure problem. Rather, they were operational in nature. Specifically, they stemmed from a breakdown in communications within the water treatment plant, a failure of personnel to respond appropriately to water testing data that indicated trouble, and a lack of timely implementation of the corrective action plan which is set forth in the operating procedures. That corrective action plan is designed to prevent the problems that we're seeing from escalating. In short, in both instances, the issues experienced with the water supply could have been prevented through attentiveness to data, through effective decision-making, and timely adherence to established protocols. The issues which led to the boil water notices were simply put the result of human error. And I called this meeting tonight because I think it's important for the public to learn the facts regarding these incidents so that we can all move forward based on those established facts rather than based on speculation and guesses. So I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Garza, who will walk us through more detailed analysis, show supporting data, give additional context, and then present the subcommittee's findings and the evidence that supports those. So, Mr. Garza.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you for that overview, Mayor. It certainly has been a very busy few weeks since the occurrence of the first boil water notice and since the creation of the subcommittee. I think it's important to note that the subcommittee started meeting immediately after you appointed that committee that same week. And so I think it's important that the public also be aware that this is something that we all took very seriously immediately following that first boil water notice. And a lot of the information that the mayor has mentioned that was provided to the subcommittee, we had ready because we had already initiated, even before the creation of the subcommittee, our own internal review process, our own internal investigation, if you will, because regardless of whether the subcommittee would have been created or not, it still would have been my responsibility to ensure that we found out what happened and what we needed to do in order to prevent it from happening again. It's not compliant with me, James. I'm not lying. Okay. All right, so as the mayor suggested, the committee under his leadership broke down into 6 different phases. The first phase was an educational phase, and as the mayor suggested, it included an overview of just our treatment processes. It included an overview of a historical overview on the transition that went from groundwater to surface water, because that transition is important because it helps explain why certain infrastructure is where it is. So for example, that helps explain why the water first goes to water plant 3. And I'll explain in a visual later what that process implies. We went through some changes that have occurred throughout the years. And so as an example, one of the questions that we get often is the city adding fluoride to the water system? And we have not been adding fluoride in over 6 years. And so we shared with council, where in the plant that area used to be located, where that used to take place as an example. So we really walked them through an overview of the entire process, while obviously focusing on the pressing matter, which is related to the chloramines and or the free chlorine, which just recently concluded with the chlorine conversion. And to that end, I want to reemphasize that the chlorine conversion is something that we do on an annual basis. This is a snapshot of what the TCEQ website looks like as it relates to the free chlorine conversion. It's a very common practice. We've been doing this every single year since the surface water treatment plant was opened almost 24 years ago. It is part of just normal maintenance. One of the things that I'll get into is explaining what nitrification is, but doing the chlorine conversion allows the system to basically cleanse itself at minimum once a year, to eliminate some of that nitrification that might have been built up throughout the year. Yes, sir.
We have to have their permission, correct?
Yes, absolutely,
We can't
yes.
just willy-nilly do this on our...
Yes, we have to get authorization from TCEQ to conduct the free chlorine conversion. There are certain parameters that are laid out by them that necessitate advance notice to hospitals, dialysis centers, and any other place of that sort. And so it isn't something that we can just do in a pinch. It requires coordination with TCEQ.
Thank you.
Yeah. And to that end, we figured that there would be some questions regarding this. And so just a couple of the other components in here that I haven't already mentioned is basically a refresher that this year's chlorine conversion began July 12th and lasted through August 11th. And that's very, very relevant when I share a timeline later. So what is nitrification? So nitrification basically is a biological process that converts ammonia and similar nitrogen compounds into nitrites. And currently, our normal way of treating water is by using chloramines, which is a combination of chlorine and ammonia. And so one of the, side effects of using chloramines is that if that ammonia sort of gets left to linger and react with other components, it could lead to nitrification. And nitrification from a scientific standpoint combats the chlorine residual. And so the easiest way to think of this is that in order to maintain an effective chlorine residual, we need to keep nitrification under control. That's the science, behind it. And so one way to do it proactively is through the chlorine conversion that takes place once a year, as an example. In addition to that, there are some components, this is also straight from the TCEQ website, that could help prevent nitrification. And so some of those include the sampling. And so I'll walk you through some changes in sampling that we've already introduced. And basically what the sampling entails is that it facilitates following a nitrification action plan, which I'll walk you through here in a minute. One of the components that contributes to the increased nitrification is the reduction of water use, where basically when water just isn't consumed and is just standing still, that helps grow the nitrification. There's a lot of preventative maintenance that could help control nitrification, such as flushing fire hydrants, and I'll walk you through that. And there are some components that are associated with old infrastructure. And so cast iron pipes, as an example, can contribute to nitrification. And I'll walk you through sort of each of these. And to some extent, I'm already beginning to foreshadow, and so has the mayor, about where we might have had some issues that didn't allow us the ability to prevent the nitrification. Nothing, James. Next slide, James, please. So this is, I have a few slides talking about the nitrification action plan, and basically the nitrification action plan is intended to help keep nitrification under control. And there's several elements to the nitrification action plan, ranging to recommendations on how often you sample for nitrification, to how you do it, to things to look out for. But ultimately, the thing that I want to share with you, mainly as it relates to the plan, is that it has trigger points. The plan is very, very intentionally designed in a color-coded mechanism that tells us what to do in which scenario. And so as an example, they have yellow flag alerts and red flag alarms. And if I keep going, you'll see that there's the green, which signifies normal operations. And so depending on the results of the nitrification tests determines how you proceed. And so as an example, yellow flag, right? We're familiar with these colors and what they mean, right? Yellow is a warning. And so if we happen to test for nitrification and it's at a level that falls within the yellow category, the plan very specifically outlines what you ought to do in that scenario. And it could include things like flushing fire hydrants or flushing the system, which could be done at the fire hydrant or water towers, but in essence, flushing the system. And the plan itself very clearly conveys, next slide, James, very clearly conveys what happens once you get to the red flag correction action. And you'll see at the very, very bottom of this plan that the free chlorine conversion is within that red flag corrective action. And so if you think of this in terms of level of severity, right, basically what we ended up doing and moving up the free chlorine conversion basically told us that we had reached a level red in the nitrification action plan. And that's why that was the only solution to rescinding the boil water notice during the first boil water notice. So, okay, thank you. So to the mayor's point, we confirmed timelines, and so this is it contains a little bit more information compared to the timeline that I shared a couple council meetings ago. And so for some additional background related to the first boil water notice. So on July 3rd, we received a complaint from a customer near the intersection of John Stockbauer and Miori calling about a concern related to our pH levels. And so immediately, as staff always does when receiving these types of calls, we sent an operator. The operator tested the pH levels and it came back within normal. However, that was not satisfactory to the resident, and so the customer, I should say. And so the customer did advise at the time to staff that they would be submitting a complaint to TCEQ. And that's very, very, very relevant to why TCEQ ended up on site on July 8th. And in case you're wondering what happened with that pH issue, it ended up being an issue on the private side of the line, not on the public system side of the line. And so we ended up resolving that, if you will, by placing a backflow preventer at the meter and then simply allowing the property owners and tenants to figure out the issue on their side of the meter. But the connection with the first boil water notice is that that's why TCEQ was on site on July 8th. And so TCEQ arrived on site at that area of John Stockbauer and Miori, and they conducted a very holistic water testing at the site. That's relevant, or that's good. That's important to keep in mind, because when our personnel went on site on July 3rd, they only checked for pH levels. It wasn't a thorough analysis of the entire water quality. TCEQ, however, did do that. And so that's when they began the clock on a 24-hour notice to us to begin to basically get the chlorine residual within range. We all thought that we would be able to resolve that issue through localized flushing. That didn't work. And you may recall me mentioning a couple meetings ago that it was sort of an escalated response as we started to realize the severity of the nitrification in the system. And so we were under the impression, we being Public Works leadership, myself, management, even with conversations that I had with you on that Tuesday and Wednesday, we thought that simply flushing was going to do the trick. Unfortunately, as we've all realized, the level of nitrification in the system was severe. And so we ended up realizing, unfortunately, that we were in that red category. And I put these color bars here at the bottom to kind of just illustrate how basically the severity of nitrification was pretty severe, which ultimately led to the chlorine conversion being the only solution to it. Now, the downside to that, of course, is that it took time. And so we were under this boil water notice for 6 days. But as I mentioned earlier, once you complete the chlorine conversion process, it's basically a restart button. And so in theory, you kind of go back to the green. But the thing to keep in mind is that the chlorine conversion process lasts 30 days. And I'll come back to that later. It's not something that happens instantaneously throughout your whole system. This is just a map that I shared a couple meetings ago, kind of highlighting that area with that area of John Stock Bar and Murray with a star to kind of highlight that the area of concern, if you will, was in that low pressure plain area just south of Mockingbird. And it's important too to note that even though this was somewhat isolated to an area, because of its geography, it would have made it very difficult to articulate that. Would have made it very difficult to articulate that it was only in this area. It would have been very difficult to articulate, developing a map. And so it made it for very challenging, it made it challenging to communicate the area that would be impacted. But at the end of the day, TCEQ requires you to issue the boil water notice for the whole system. So some key points. So as I've already mentioned, we expected the boil water notice to last a couple of days, but because of the severity of nitrification, it ended up lasting 6 days. And so naturally, there was some questions that came out of that. Why was the nitrification allowed to permeate to that degree? Why did it take TCEQ involvement to alert us of this issue? Could it have been prevented? Obviously, you've already heard that the answer is yes to that, but I'll walk you through how that's the case. So just as a refresher, these are the different elements that can contribute to preventing nitrification. And I'll walk you through what we basically found as it relates to these elements. So one of the very first things that we did was look at logs. And I want to, before I kind of walk you through what you're looking at, I want to point out the fact that one of the things that became very evident early on was just how manual, how paper intensive the logging process currently is at the surface water treatment plant. You're looking at a nice chart that could be very easily reviewed, and you could very easily draw conclusions by looking at this chart. The systems that we have don't produce charts like this. The system that we have is a written log that goes in a binder. And so if somebody wanted to try and catch a trend, they'd have to physically flip through pages to go back and forth to kind of visualize a trend. Now, still doable, still expected of individuals to do that, but I just want to be very clear that it's not technology like what you're seeing now. And so what you're seeing is basically a history that goes back to March of chlorine residuals at our different water towers, because we wanted to see, were there any trends that were missed? And I very specifically highlighted Tower 3 in a color that would stand out, because you'll see that Tower 3 was the one that basically was low for a longish period of time. And as we've learned, the threshold for TCEQ is that 0.5. And so you could see how Tower 3, dating back to the end of May, early June, had already dipped below that 0.5. You see that there's an overall decline, though, in chlorine residual throughout the system. And so this is what could have, in theory, been identified as signs of nitrification, as signs of a missed opportunity to begin implementing the nitrification action plan. And what's interesting about it is that Tower 3 is the area that feeds water to that central part of town that was impacted by the first boil water notice. You'll notice here, one of the things that I'll mention later is that we've switched testing the towers for chlorine residuals from a weekly log to a daily log. And so you'll notice here that towards the latter half of July, this data is already daily data as opposed to weekly. And so as simple of a change as that might sound, that obviously allows us to track changes in the volatility of the chlorine residual level much quicker than having data that's weekly. Now, naturally, looking at data, looking at the logs, we asked ourselves a lot of questions as to, well, whose responsibility is it to review the logs? What happened? Why was this missed? And really the best way that I thought we could discern some of that was to conduct a formal internal investigation. We asked HR to spearhead that, and so they conducted interviews of employees, they reviewed some logs themselves, and ultimately some of the observations made by that investigation basically brought to the surface that there was some very clear communication breakdown among staff that obviously led to not implementing that nitrification action plan in a timely manner. It also came out that while we have some operating procedures, there's also a lot that are missing. What do you do when you see a reading that reads below the required level? There isn't a very clear black and white process for staff to follow. And so it's sort of just been something that's been perhaps passed down from employee to employee, but nothing that's documented to the degree that it needs to. There was a clear deference to plant management. And so one of the things that we've identified as a sort of organizational cultural element at the surface water treatment plant is that there's just a lot of deference to plant management, which obviously goes counter to what I expect. I think we can all expect that everybody be empowered to make decisions, to bring issues to light, to prevent things like what happened from happening, right? One of the things that also came out of this internal investigation was this reality of the impact that being short-staffed has on the operation. So you heard me mention already that one of the issues that helps reduce nitrification is that active flushing. And so when we're short-staffed, it makes it very difficult to keep up with the flushing maintenance schedule. And so really quickly, little overview on the staffing. So there's 15 positions at the surface water treatment plant. Of course, it starts with the manager. You have a chief operator, a maintenance supervisor. We have instrumentation and controls technician. We have 7 operators. And that's the area that I want to focus on because it's really on the operational side that a lot of this responsibility of testing and sampling falls into play. The middle portion of it that you see as plant maintenance supervisor, that's sort of the physical component of the plant. But the testing, the sampling, the reporting, all of that falls on the operators. One thing to note on the operators is that I asked HR to pull a little bit of history on them in terms of tenure. And on average, from the folks that we have, it's basically averages out to about 3.5 years with us. And so what that tells me is that as we have lost experienced operators, there hasn't been a very clear operations manual that has been left behind for somebody new to really kind of follow what the process ought to be. I want to hit a little bit on vacancies. And so you'll see here that we have 4 vacancies at the surface water treatment plant. We do have a key vacancy in the surface water treatment plant manager position. That was a vacancy that occurred shortly after the first boil water notice, and obviously a very key position that we need to focus on filling. I also included the utilities division of public works in this because what we learned through this process is that whenever the surface water treatment plant is short-staffed and they need that manpower, if you will, to help with flushing because they just don't have the manpower there, they lean on the utilities division for that assistance. And so while it's not the utilities division of public works' primary responsibility to help with flushing, they're there as a backup. But if that backup is depleted themselves, then it makes it difficult to provide that coverage, right? And so I also asked staff, well, when was the last time that the surface water treatment plant was fully staffed? And it was actually, ironically, earlier this year, but that doesn't really tell the full picture. What tells really the big picture here is that out of the last 30 months, the surface water treatment plant has only been fully staffed 7 out of those 30 months, just to give you a sense of the vacancy situation at the surface water treatment plant. And to be clear, and I should have started with this, the intent in providing this information is not to make excuses. The intent of providing this information is to provide the facts so that we can really develop a strategy on how to improve upon them. It is obviously at the end of the day my responsibility as city manager to make sure that we do what we can to fill vacancies, to make sure that we do what we can for that employees, so that employees have the tools and the resources that they need to be successful. But understanding what went wrong and where we have points of weakness, I think, is important to help us come out stronger at the end of this. So we then transitioned to systems and process overview. I already alluded to the changes in sampling. And so one of those was the shift in testing water towers from weekly to daily. One of the things that also is a contributing factor, of course, to nitrification is for testing for nitrification itself. That currently takes place every 90 days. And as we've learned, a lot can happen within a 90-day window. And so we've changed testing for that nitrification to go above and beyond what TCEQ requires. So TCEQ requires to test for nitrification every 90 days. We have now changed that to become a weekly process. We think that we need to be very proactive and very aggressive with this testing to ensure that things don't fall through the cracks. And one of the ways to ensure that things don't fall through the cracks is by leveraging on technology. And so later you'll hear me talk about some software, but in the meantime, rather than solely logging readings into a physical book that in theory only 1 or 2 people have access to physically, they've developed a system that now translates that data into a shared electronic file so that at minimum Public Works leadership can have access to that data as well. I want to talk a little bit about the water consumption piece. And recall, we have a high pressure plane and a low pressure plane. The airport area is part of the low pressure plane. Of course, that's relevant as it relates to the second boil water notice, but just keep that in mind. And keep in mind that water towers 3 and 5 are the main ones, well, and 1's down here, but are the main ones that feed the low pressure plane. And so when it comes to water age, I mentioned earlier that understanding the history of our system is important because when the city changed from groundwater to surface water, rightfully so, it assessed the overall system and asked itself, how much of this infrastructure can we keep using? That's the smart thing to do at the time, right? Because you just saves money. Well, what that did to the low pressure plane is that it has the water running from the surface water treatment plant to the storage tanks at water plant 3 before they get to water towers 3 and 5. So there's a whole other step and there's a whole other storage area of water that takes place between the water leaving the plant and entering the distribution system. What this means basically is that water in the low pressure plane gets older quicker and sits longer. When low water consumption is low, obviously water in the water tanks just stands still. And what happens when water in tanks stands still? It can feed nitrification, right? And so that's very, very important because ultimately what we've discovered is that the low pressure plane is more susceptible to nitrification compared to the high pressure plane, which could help us prioritize any improvements that we want to make out in the system.
Mr. Garza, just
Yes,
for
sir.
more identification, Plant 3 is located at Airline in Ben Jordan, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that gives people a point of reference.
Yes, sir. And so one of the things that we also looked at was let's just look at how much water we were processing out of the plant. So this chart shows what it looks like basically for June and July. The red line, again, intentional because that's the line I want you to focus on, is this year's treated water. The blue line is last year. You can see a very clear reduction in the amount of water coming out of the water plant this summer. And that could be due to a couple of reasons. One, of course, we had a lot of rain. And when it rains, people aren't irrigating as much, which limits the amount of water coming out of the plant. But the other thing that we discovered that we found interesting is that we were also under certain drought contingency stages. And so what's kind of it's kind of a paradox as it relates to how to conserve or utilize water, because on one hand, we know that water needs to run through the system to prevent nitrification. But on the other, right, during drought contingency stages, we're asking people to not irrigate. And when it rains itself, people aren't doing it because it just rained. But keep in mind that when we issue these drought stages, it has zero to do with rain in Victoria and has all to do with the level of the river. And so in this particular instance, we were under a stage 3 from May 21st through June 13th. And so we were very aggressive, if you will, with our expectation of the public to conserve water during that time frame, while at the same time it raining here as well, which provided a double whammy of dropped consumption in the system. So again, when you drop consumption, people aren't using it, that water just stays in the system, which feeds nitrification, right? And so we begin to sort of start to understand that there's these different contributing factors that TCEQ tells us themselves are contributing factors, right? Another element that we know is a contributing factor is the aging infrastructure. And so staff put together a map showing the cast iron lines, which is roughly 60 miles, which represents roughly 15% of the total miles of water lines that are out in the system. This map kind of gives you a sense of where those are located. And of course, to no surprise, they're in the southern part of town and in the, I guess, central area of town. Staff went ahead and also put some recent projects on there. And so as an example, College Park and Bon Air, those lines were replaced this year. The Laurent line was completed in November of 2024. And so we added a couple of projects that recently were completed, and then we added a couple that are actually in the current CIP window. And so those include the project on Airline, as well as Crestwood and Vine. And so that brings us to the root cause analysis of the first boil water notice, which of course the mayor already alluded to, but was backed up by research and investigation and the exercises that we went through. And so we can confidently convey that it was due to low consumption of water, but more specifically, lack of flushing maintenance. And so as I alluded to, staff struggles to keep up with flushing schedules because of being short-staffed. And that, of course, is the issue. That would combat the low consumption, right? Of course, there was a delay in implementation of the nitrification action plan, as we alluded to. We believe that at minimum, that plan should have started being enacted at the beginning of June, which of course was a little over a month prior to issuing that first boil water notice in July. And then I mentioned the lack of clear standard operating procedures, because we do believe that having more clear standard operating procedures could have elevated that issue, and that issue could have been exposed to more people, which would have, of course, increased the chances of something being done about it. And some of this is repetitive. I won't repeat it, but obviously it could have been prevented for the reasons that I've already described. Any questions on the first boil water notice before I go through the same steps for the second?
Before you go on, in regards to testing, were there ever any positive bacteria testing results?
No, sir.
Thank you. That's very important to note.
Okay, so a little bit of background that leading up, if you will, to the second boil water notice. Recall earlier that I mentioned that the chlorine conversion is not something that happens immediately. There's a reason why that chlorine conversion process takes almost the whole month. And really the logic there is that the idea is that we're basically getting the water that has that free chlorine through the whole system organically, right? Because we also don't want to flush everywhere to speed up that process, because then at that point, we could be in theory just wasting water, right? And so it's been proven that over roughly 30 days, the system will naturally change out the water within itself. And so naturally, areas that are in the outskirts of the system are harder to reach because people aren't turning on those faucets, people aren't irrigating, it might be a dead-end line, right? And so it necessitates a very intentional process to get the water with the free chlorine in it through the whole system. And so staff was doing that. And so in the early morning of August 6th, staff went to that area by the airport to flush, to try and improve and try and get the water with the free chlorine to that area. However, before they left that area, they could not reach a chlorine residual that fell within standard. Coincidentally, TCEQ made us aware that same morning that they had received a complaint near that affected area that, in the absence of details from TCEQ, we believe was a complaint they received in relation to the first boil water notice, but coincidentally had them on site the morning of August 6th near that area where staff was attempting to catch up with flushing. And so immediately, similar to the first situation, the inspector of TCEQ that came out on site granted us 24 hours to resolve the problem. An hour later, TCEQ decided to not grant that 24-hour grace period that they had granted the first time and that they normally grant in similar situations. And so after several hours of meetings with TCEQ in person, with phone calls with TCEQ leadership on the phone, it was ultimately finalized by them that we would need to issue the boil water notice immediately. Now, simultaneous to our effort to try and work collaboratively with the TCEQ, staff was already working diligently to flush the area to get it within compliance. And so ultimately how this ended up shaking out was that by the time we issued the boil water notice, which happened to be at around 5:40-ish p.m. on Wednesday, August 6th, we had basically, by 6 p.m. that evening, had already restored the chlorine residual in that area to within compliance. Then, of course, whenever you issue a boil water notice, you ask yourself, well, what is the process to get out of it? We received confirmation from TCEQ on the morning of August 7th on what that process would be, which would be that they would come in, they would confirm the chlorine residual, and then they would require us to take the bacteria testing samples, which of course everybody learned about during the first boil water notice, take 24 hours to receive the results. The TCEQ inspector came on site, they tested the sample sites near the airport, and then went around the whole system, testing random spots throughout the extremities of the system, just to make sure that chlorine residual was being met throughout the entire system. And so ultimately, we received the green light from TCEQ to take the back teas roughly 24 hours after we had actually resolved the issue. And then ultimately, obviously, we had to wait the 24 hours to rescind the boil water notice after the test confirmed that there was no bacteria present in the system. This, of course, the fact that this was a little bit and very clearly isolated, and the fact that we had resolved the issue by 6 p.m. the day of, we felt very confident in conveying and sharing the map. And we felt very confident in our communication that the system was fine, in spite of the fact that we had to issue the boil water notice per TCEQ direction. So some key points related to the second. The chlorine conversion was still in process. Recall that this happened on August 6th. We finished the chlorine conversion process a couple of nights ago. One clear component related to the second boil water notice was that TCEQ very clearly denied our request for the 24-hour grace period, even though they had initially granted it. We resolved the issue within 24 hours, and our response, quite frankly, matched that shorter time frame. And so I know that many people and some of you ask questions around, well, are there going to be press briefings? Is there consideration for another credit? A completely different situation. You know, the first boil water notice, there was a lot of uncertainty there at the beginning. We did not know that it was going to last 6 days. And so our consideration, my consideration for a credit The consideration for press briefings related to, in the first boil water notice had to do with the fact that that situation extended for longer than a couple of days. Now, obviously, after it happened twice, rightfully so, everybody's asking, how could this be? This makes no sense. I knew immediately on that August 6th, especially after our communication with TCEQ that afternoon, that obviously the fact that we had to issue the second boil water notice was going to increase the sense of urgency amongst you, amongst the public, to figure out what's going on. And so we started to get to work immediately in investigating, interviewing employees, really trying to figure out what happened. Because we knew, even though at the time we didn't know it would be tonight, we knew that we were going to have to provide some clear answers very quickly. And so HR did its thing. HR interviewed employees in a very, very quick turnaround to try and find out what happened and what led to the second boil water notice. And very similar themes started to kind of come up. But some new things that came up was related to this reliance on informal handoffs, which to us basically just illustrates the fact that we need better operating procedures. Because what happened that morning was that we had an overnight shift that came off shift at 7 a.m. and things weren't adequately conveyed. So the new shift, right, didn't necessarily immediately go back to the area to continue the flushing exercise. In addition, that shift that worked during the day did not necessarily have the staffing compared to, I guess the way that I could word that is that obviously there are operators during the day, but one of those was specifically in training and wasn't necessarily full-blown at a point in their onboarding process where they could have been sent out on their own. And so what that brought to light was this issue of, well, where does that help come from? You know, if the staff at the surface water treatment plant can't get out to flush an area, even though they know that it needs to be flushed, where does that help come from? And as I alluded to earlier, it comes from the Utilities Division in Public Works. And what we realized was that there aren't any clear operating procedures on how to get that help from the Utilities Division, because it all basically came down to plant management. And so that deference to plant management kept coming up. And so that's why for us, it's important that we focus on changing the culture at the plant so that everybody feels empowered and that there's some clear procedures to ensure that things are followed through. And I'll get more into that here in a bit. I wanted to take a minute under the second boil water notice to highlight a couple of other points related to flushing. This map is hard to see, but there's actually 200 little blue dots throughout the entire city. Each one of these blue dots, per TCQ requirement, needs to be flushed monthly. When you have a staff of 6 and you have 3 vacancies, you can imagine the challenge in flushing and getting to these 200 sites throughout our system. There's been a lot of discussion internally about how did we ever even get to the point of having 200 points needing flushing. That's a conversation for another day. But the reality is that we do have that 200 flushing sites throughout our system. We do have 13 automated flushers, and I'll talk more about automated flushers here in a little bit, but we do have 13 spread out throughout the extremities of the system to help alleviate some of that pressure on staff. And what's interesting about this particular I guess situation is that area by the airport actually has a automated flusher, but this whole process determined that automated flusher wasn't working properly. And so it again brought up to light the fact that there is no standard operating procedure that secures or that requires that these automated flushers are checked up on every so often. And so we actually now have one. And so now there's a requirement that they be checked monthly. And in case you're wondering, it got fixed, all the others were checked, and they're working just fine. But a couple of other causes, and it probably goes without saying, but obviously there was the break-in response that I alluded to, TCQ's denial of the 24-hour grace period, the low consumption, and the fact that the chlorine conversion was still in process. And I want to be very clear that in spite of TCQ's decision to not grant that grace period, we could have prevented this.
I don't think it would be appropriate for us to sort of just pass the buck and say that the only reason why we entered into the second bulk water notice was because of TCEQ not granting that grace period. We very clearly missed an opportunity for that continuance effort to flush that area that was missed due to that gap between that overnight shift coming off and things not properly being figured out with the new shift that came in. We missed critical hours there that potentially, and there's no way to know for sure, but that potentially could have prevented the second bulk water notice, because in theory, it would have been resolved sooner. And potentially, if we're talking about a 4 or 5 hour gap in time there, that 4 or 5 hours we could have used in the afternoon when we were trying to request that grace period, right? We solved it at 6 p.m. If we would have had that 4 hours in the morning and used up those 4 or 5 hours in the morning, we would have solved it by noon. And it would have made the case to TCEQ much stronger, right, to avoid the boil water notice. And so I just want to be very clear that we could have prevented, I believe, the second boil water notice by simply just being more responsive to what was happening out there. So recommendations and next steps. I know it sounds cliche, but ultimately it boils down to people, process, and technology and equipment. I echo the mayor's sentiments that while there may be some infrastructure contributing factors, such as the cast iron lines, it's irrelevant to what could have prevented these boil water notices and are irrelevant to preventing it from happening again. And so we need to really focus on the areas that we can control. And so obviously from my standpoint as city manager, those focus on people and process. And this isn't something that we're sort of just doing on our own, and I'll get to that here in a minute. I certainly lean on Public Works leadership, and so one of the operational changes that we made, especially because we don't have currently a surface water treatment plant manager out there, is that the Public Works Assistant Director and the Operations Manager are on site at the plant. We're also leveraging some experience from some supplemental management services that I'll get into here in a bit. And they're all basically responsible to oversee this change management process that needs to happen at the plant. Because clearly, we need to improve our standard operating procedures. We need to improve the culture of one of greater accountability. And so they're all in ensuring that change happens. Now, simultaneous to that, we know that there's a direct correlation between that and, of course, the vacancies. And so we need to obviously hire a new surface water treatment plant manager. We need to be more aggressive with retention and recruitment for the utilities division, as well as for the surface water treatment plant. One of the things that I think has become very apparent through this unfortunate situation is that it has made us all very well aware of the fact that every position with the city of Victoria is important. I know that oftentimes it's easy to only talk about certain, let's say, public safety personnel, but I think it's important that we keep in mind that every division, every department within the city is equally as important. And so we need to ensure that we're doing the best we can to pay the utilities division as much as we can, and obviously the folks at the surface water treatment plant. And so that's gonna be a big priority of mine. I know we haven't had a chance to have a follow-up meeting with the compensation committee, but that's something that is gonna be a big topic of conversation at the next compensation committee meeting. While we do all of that though, we definitely need to develop a plan for supplemental staff. And so, or to supplement staff, some contingency plans. And so there's ideas circulating internally about, well, maybe we can develop a log of maybe individuals that used to work for us that are retired, but that maybe are willing to kind of come in on a short-term basis if needed, if we just need them, right? And so we're working on developing more intentional plans to bring in additional staff support if we need it. And we need to do a better job of cross-training amongst the divisions of Public Works. Because as I said, even though it's not the primary responsibility of the Utilities Division of Public Works to do things at the surface water treatment plant, there needs to be enough cross-training there to where some of those individuals can come over to the surface water treatment plant and understand what is a nitrification action plan, how does it correlate to flushing, right? We need to really understand that. They need to really understand that. And so to help do that, we are looking to partner with a couple of groups to help us review our operations manuals, help us provide some training, do some assessments. And so we, in response to the first boil water notice and in response to the vacancy of the surface water treatment plant manager position that happened shortly after the first boil water notice, we had already engaged Texas Utilities and Environmental. And so their owner had already been engaged and is already, is not a full-time position, but he's already spending some time at the surface water treatment plant to help assess our personnel, help assess our processes, help develop some recommendations on how to just improve things out there to be more consistent. Outside of that, we've also been in communication with the Texas Optimization Program, which is actually a division of TCEQ. This Texas Optimization Program, even though it's branded and is a offshoot of TCEQ, it really runs independently from the enforcement side. And so this Texas Optimization Program is basically a resource of trainers that can go out to different communities to train for things like the nitrification action plan, how you implement it, how you go about non-directional flushing, updating standard operating procedures, et cetera. And we already have them scheduled. And so they're already scheduled to conduct some training here at the end of this month, as well as trainings throughout the month of September. And we've already ensured, and I've already conveyed expectations that I don't just want the surface water treatment plant operators to go through that training. We need the utilities division to go through that training, right? Hence the cross-training. And also, quite frankly, management. I think we can do better even as management. I mean, I've learned a lot just the last few weeks, but in the absence of specific training, or in the absence of these unfortunate situations happening, I would have no way of really understanding the relationship, between flushing, nitrification action plan, and things of that sort. And so I think the more people that I think are educated on how all of these things are connected, I think the greater chance that things don't fall through the cracks in the future.
Mr. Garza, to your point on management, can you go back one slide real quick?
You're gonna have to help me with that.
I want to get clarification on the Public Works Assistant Director and Operations Manager are on site. That doesn't mean that they were never on site previously. What that means is that they are now moved and are officed and are day-to-day 8 to 5 on site, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, they have, correct. Obviously, they have other responsibilities as well. And they're alternating spending physical time at the plant. But the idea is that at least one of them, right, would be physically at the plant throughout the day, because we need to make sure that, the message that we're trying to send to employees out there is heard. And the only way to ensure that is if we have constant push of the expectations consistently, right?
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that.
No, thank you for the question. I've already alluded to some of this, but there are some low-hanging fruit opportunities that we can pursue on the equipment front. And so I've already mentioned that we have 13 automated flushers. We could definitely benefit from some more, and I'll show you a map here showing some proposed locations for that. We also are, going to be looking into these in-tank active water mixers. And so basically what those do is that they keep the water circulating, right? And so in the absence of us being able to just go flush the system, because quite frankly, it doesn't make sense for us to just always rely on flushing the system, because then we're just wasting water, right? And so we need to be creative and find ways on how we can keep the water circulating to try and limit nitrification, but not putting all our eggs in the basket of just flushing millions and millions of gallons of water every day. And so one way to do that is to basically explore these intact active water mixers that can be placed in a water tower, and I assume in a ground storage tank as well, that basically just rotate the water through and it keeps it flowing. I mentioned earlier about just how old school some of the processes of logging information are at the plant. There's definitely a need to ensure that there's always a old school mechanism to do it, because as we've learned and the committee learned in hearing from Mike, who's our consultant that's out there right now, you need to have that, because a computer system can go down. People can manipulate data on an Excel sheet, right? But you can't manipulate a physical log. And so it needs to be a dual focus on continuing to find ways to ensure that information gets modernized. Greg, for example, shared with the committee that in a previous place that he used to work, a lot that information that would go into the log would be put into a software, and that software would allow you to basically predetermine triggers that would send alerts to different individuals depending on the situation, and that's currently in design. And so we are currently already pursuing that. But while that's in process, they're doing the shared folder approach that I shared earlier. And of course, we've mentioned in previous meetings the need to look at our SCADA system just to kind of figure out, okay, what other modernization needs to take place there. Currently, the plan and the cost that we have associated with SCADA are a few years old. And so the next step in that process would be to re-engage the engineer and just update the plan. We know a lot, we have a better feel now of what we want out of a SCADA system than what we did 3 years ago. Some of that just by, situations that have happened. But that'd be the next step in that process. This is a map. I know it's difficult to see, but you'll see that there's little triangles that basically illustrate the current location of those 13 automated flushers. And so you see very faintly, but there's one in that area by the airport. That's the one that failed, that is now fixed. But that is why, right, getting out to some of these areas sometimes isn't front and center with staff because there's this reliance on that automated flusher, right? But nonetheless, there are some proposed sites for automated flushers, and so you'll see those with a purplish square. And so we are in the process of procuring those. And then next steps, from my perspective, it's about continuing prioritizing people and process improvements. It's what I have most direct control over. And so that's what our focus is. We want to finalize and implement the ongoing recommendations from those external assessments, both from Mike and also from TCEQ. We want to, of course, finalize the recommendations for equipment and software improvements. If those are elements that I can just sign off on, then so be it. Obviously, if those are elements that need to come for council approval, then we'll do that. And then, of course, we'll continue to work with the subcommittee to finalize a more thorough written report that'll, of course, take even a deeper dive into some of the backup data that has been presented to you tonight at a very high level. We do believe that a final written report will shed some light to an even further degree on areas that we need to improve on, as well as TCQ's role. And so with that, happy to answer any questions you might have.
There's a lot of information. I appreciate that. Are there any specific questions that anybody has for Mr. Garza? Dr. Young, you look like you have one.
It's not indigestion or anything. I know. I mean, we've hit on it, the technology and everything else, and hit on the lack of communication, which I think a lot of it ultimately comes down to, and improving those processes so that this never happens again is ultimately important. You've hit on them, and thank you for doing that. There's still more work to come, I understand, and we'll improve the process with continued work, and it'll take money. Understandably so. We'll figure out, costs that's yet to be determined. But I appreciate the committee going through this process. I appreciate staff going through this process. I'm sorry we had to be here to go through this process. We will come out better.
It's all we can do at this point, right? And you certainly
the public
have.
deserves better.
Oh, 100%. And you, from whatever it's worth, you have my 100%, commitment that, we'll do our part as management to ensure that change happens. And while we're in the middle of still trying to figure out exactly how that looks and what that looks, I assure you that we are and we will hold staff accountable. Now, that doesn't mean firing staff, but accountability is about making sure people have clear expectations that when they're not met, there's very specific consequences to that. Holding employees accountable means ensuring that they understand what's at stake, that they have the tools and the resources that they need to be successful. And I assure you that I'm doing my part to ensure that that takes place.
Any other comments or questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Historically, how many times on average have we been investigated by TCEQ and found to be out of compliance? Because this seems like a very recent,
Sure. So keep in mind that TCEQ delves into a lot of areas of our operation. And so TCEQ has regulatory oversight of our landfill, as an example. They have regulatory oversight of air quality elements. They have regulatory oversight of our wastewater treatment plants. So there's a lot of components that we're involved with. And so we would have to go back, and do really and do research. TCEQ investigates a lot of things, as the mayor's finding out. They send him a lot of correspondence, but we'd have to do some research to kind of pull that. Now, if you specifically mean as it relates to the water system, right? This is the first time that this has happened where they come in and at the, I don't know how to word this. I guess they come in at the request of a complaint. And look into the matter and then realize that there's an issue.
I did mean specific to water, and thank you for sharing that, because I think it kind of solidifies, although we've looked at moving forward what needs to happen, I think that it says or speaks volumes to what's been in place in the past. Although it's fallen short recently, I think it speaks volumes to the dedication of the individuals that work with our water treatment plant, that we've had investigations before, and this would be the first time that we've been in this situation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you mentioning that. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? All right. Mr. Garza, thank you. I just have a couple of things just to close with. Thank you for that detailed presentation. I think what we've heard tonight is clear, that the cause of these boil water notices have been identified, and they are operational in nature. As previously mentioned, the subcommittee will now go through our later processes, our later steps, and we'll shift our focus to further development of targeted, practical, effective solutions that will make our water system that much better. I am certain that they will include additional improvements to operational and communication processes. But that's not to say that other aspects of the system have been or will be ignored in the subcommittee's work. Quite to the contrary, we intend to explore potential equipment and technology enhancements, as Mr. Garza has alluded to, with an eye toward reducing the likelihood and potential impact of human error in the operational process. How can we get technology? How can we have better equipment that reduces the potential for human error and the impact if human error does occur? This work will be done with the same care and diligence as our review of the incident causes, and we will include further public updates as we move forward. So, our responsibility as city leadership is to deal in facts. And obviously, this is a very fact-intensive presentation. But you need good facts to make informed decisions and to act in the best interest of the community. Our intent was not and is not to act in haste, but to act with precision and with purpose. And I want to thank our residents for their patience. And I ask that you continue to rely on official updates from the city for accurate information. In closing, I want to assure the citizens of Victoria that we will get this right, and we will do this the right way. So thank you again for everyone who's attending and those who tuned in. And I believe that covers our agenda for the evening, so we are adjourned.